So hi guys, it's Alex here with another video in our Caro-Kann series, our Caro-Kann repertoire. And this time around, I'm going to show the fantasy variation and how to play against it. So let's put it on the board. The moves are e4, c6, d4, and d5. No surprises until now. And here, well, white has to deal with the threat of capturing the pawn on e4, and the fantasy variation involves the move pawn to f3. The idea makes a lot of sense. If now black captures, white is prepared to recapture with the pawn on e4 and have a very strong center. In addition, here white would have the f3 square, where he could develop his knight very quickly. His bishop could come to c4, he could castle on the king side, and believe me, there are some really nasty sacrificial ideas around f7. I've actually played many times online. I like to play in fast games of chess. I like to capture because it leads to crazy positions. But I have lost more games quickly in this variation than I can count. So when it comes to serious tournament games, I do not recommend to capture on e4. It's really a little bit too adventurous. And instead, the move that we're going to recommend is the move e6, which takes the game a little bit into French defense waters, when we can see that it would be as if white had started with e4, black had played e6, white had continued with d4, black had played d5, a French defense, which is a perfectly good opening, and then we include the moves f3 and c6. The argument is that this leads to a very decent variation of the French defense, because the move c6 for us is a little bit more useful than the move f3 for white in this French defense structure in the center. But it's something that we need to be aware of, because otherwise, as a Caro-Kann player, if you're not used to this, you might get a little bit frustrated by the difficulty, or in fact, how impossible it is that this bishop is developed to the typical squares of either f5 in most variations or g4, as we see in the Caro-Kann exchange variation. So this is the first thing to note. We will play e6, and here white typically plays knight c3, supporting his center. And now we have to figure out how to develop. If we were to play the move knight f6, then after the move e5, knight d7, and f4, we would be in one of the sort of serious lines of the French defense. We don't really want to be, let's say, move order tricked into playing a hardcore main line of the French defense. So instead, I'm not recommending the move knight to f6, but instead black will develop his bishop to b4, pinning this knight on c3, and asking the question of white of exactly how he's going to continue his development, which is not such an easy question to answer, because, for example, if white were to continue with the move bishop d3, he may have to watch out for pawn takes e4, and the loss of the pawn on d4. He also may have to watch out for a quick c5, where the pawn on d4 is under some pressure, and it would be easy for white to go wrong with a move like knight e2, defending the pawn on d4, and now black playing c4, after which this bishop on d3 is, well, it has simply no moves. So we can see some of the dangers that await an unprepared white player against this line, which is, I think, relatively simple for black to play. Pawn to e6, and then when white plays his usual move, we pin the knight with bishop b4. Now, the most popular two moves here, our main line, is the move bishop to f4, which is a part of white's idea, key idea in this position, which is to quickly develop his queen side. So he starts with bishop f4, then he puts his queen to d3 to go for a very fast queenside castle. This is what we're going to examine as our main line. But first of all, I just want to talk about the move knight e2. This is a very reasonable move, defending d4, defending c3, and, well, we should know how to play against it. The move that I like is knight e7. Again, not knight f6, which can be played, but the knight on f6 sometimes feels a little bit more vulnerable to attack, so knight e7 instead. And now after the move a3, we don't really want to capture this knight on c3, because if we capture, then white would play knight takes c3, and we have given up the bishop pair. This is a very strong bishop, because you can see the light squared pawns, we really would prefer if we could transfer this bishop here, let's say, and then we would have a very good position. But we gave up our good bishop, the one that has a lot of potential along especially this h2b8 diagonal. And so we don't really want to do this. And we also gave up the bishop for this knight when this knight actually stands in the way of the white bishop. And these two knights are sort of competing for squares. We call these knights as competing for squares. So after the move a3, black instead would play the response bishop a5, keeping his bishop. Bishop would come to e3, knight would come to d7, and black on the next move would simply play castle. He would have a perfectly good game. Usually white would go knight g3, castle, and black at some point or another in these positions can try and break in the center with either c5 or in some situations e5, because again, with these two pawns in the core center versus black's one pawn in the core center, white does have a little bit more space. So it's very typical to break, much like we've seen in many Caro-Kann variations before. So let's see after bishop b4, instead, let's take a look now at the main choice, which is here the move bishop to f4. So after bishop to f4, black plays the knight to e7, and white puts its queen on d3, the plan that we've already identified, where white wants to castle quickly. Now the question is, what do you do with the one problem piece that black has here compared to other lines in the Caro-Kann? Remember, a lot of what the Caro-Kann is about it's about moving this bishop and developing it out of the pawn chain. In this case, the bishop stays on c8. So the idea that black has is he's going to play and he's going to develop it along this diagonal. Specifically, he's going to put his bishop on a6, and that's why for now he kept the knight on b8. So the bishop a6 is coming very, very soon. Now, white usually continues with knight e2, because if he continues with queenside castling, then black can play bishop a6, and after white moves his queen, black can actually capture the bishop, and he's once again solved this problem of the bishop. It's a little bit similar to in those lines of, say, the Caro-Kann advance. If white allows the exchange of these bishops, the big problem for black is solved, right? Because of the way in which his pawns in the center are set up. So therefore, this is not a very popular way for white to play. And so white usually puts his knight on e2 to prevent this. We still put our bishop on a6 because this is a very good diagonal. Queen is on e3. And already I think that the black position is very good here, because the black knight will not have any real difficulties in getting into the game, either via d7 or via c6. And all the other pieces are in the game, so white's advantage, if it even exists, is very minimal already. Let's see how the game can continue. Castle. Now white castles queenside. And so, on the one hand, white wants to perhaps attack the black king, but on the other, for now, the major asset that white has is a little bit of a superior situation in the center. So black should strike at the center as quickly as possible, the move c5 here. Now, white typically kicks this bishop out. If he does not do so, black will just continue with knight to c6, get good development, and actually he's quicker, in my opinion, at attacking the white king than white is at attacking the black king, because white's pawns are still on h2 and g2, whereas black's queenside pawns have advanced already quite a bit. So, therefore, after the move c5, a3, and black captures on c3. And now the question becomes how to recapture as white. Typically, white recaptures with the queen. Let's take a look at what happens if white captures with the knight. After knight takes c3, black will exchange these bishops. Rook takes f1. And now an important move to be aware of. Basically, in this position, we can see that the pawn on c5 is under fire. And so black might be tempted to defend passively with a move like knight d7. Not that this is such a bad move, but black has a nicer idea here. He can use tactics to ignore the attack on the pawn on c5 by playing the move knight bc6. Now, if white takes the pawn, if he doesn't do this, he's kind of in trouble because he has to go passive with a move like knight e2. So white should take the pawn, but black now has the idea of d4, threatening to capture the queen. White moves the queen. He cannot take the knight because white will take his queen, but he can recover the pawn on c5. In fact, I actually had a game that went exactly like this. I will say that the main move here is knight to a4, and after knight a4, black goes knight to g6, bishop to g3, and rook to c8. And basically, if white grabs this pawn on c5, black is going to have a lot of very strong attacking possibilities. So the black position is actually perfectly good here, with chances for both sides. On the one hand, you could say that white's dark square bishop is nicer than black having knights only. On the other, you could argue that black has a faster attack. You could still more further argue that this knight on a4 is a good piece in the sense that it's striking at c5. You could also argue it's not such a good piece in the sense that it's on the side of the board. And if white decides he doesn't want to capture the pawn, he cannot capture it immediately, by the way, because if knight takes c5, queen g5 check would be a problem. So if white fails to ever capture the pawn, the knight may actually feel quite out of the game. So it's a very tricky position. There's a lot of different factors to consider, but overall, I would say the chances are at least equal for black here. It's a perfectly good position, and well, one that you can research further if you would like to play it. In fact, I will just show you that in my own game, my opponent didn't play quite like this, and instead, in this position, he played the move queen to c4, striking at this undefended pawn on c5. I played queen to a5, and now a nice maneuver to be aware of. After knight a4, the pawn is under fire, but black here has the move knight to c8. And the idea is that if white captures the pawn, then black is capturing the knight. And if, on the other hand, white captures the pawn with his knight, then after the move knight to b6, the white queen cannot go anywhere without losing the defense of the knight on c5, and then black can capture the knight with his queen. So let's continue this game a little bit just to give an idea of how dangerous the position can get for white. Already black is a little bit better here. White continued with the move king to b1. I played e5, and white brought the bishop back to c1. I played rook to b8, taking advantage of the semi-open file. And here white wanted to create some kind of threats against the strong black center. And still he has the problem that he cannot capture on c5 with the knight because of knight to b6, or with the queen because the knight on a4 falls. In this variation, we can see quite clearly that the knight on a4 is a little bit misplaced. So my opponent played f4 to strike at the center in this way and generate some counterplay on the king side. However, after this move came knight to d6. Queen takes c5 was now played, because the idea is that after queen takes a4, now the knight on d6 is falling. But here black has an extremely strong move and has a winning position after knight to b5. Well, white captured this knight on c6, and now black played rook f to c8. And we can see all of the black pieces are attacking the white position. The white queen has to move, and also the knight on a4 is about to fall. So from a black perspective, it's not a big deal to be down a piece for now. Additionally, black at the right moment will be able to capture the pawn on a3, because white will not be able to capture back due to the fact that the b pawn is pinned. This position is already lost. The game ended with the moves queen d7, rook c7, queen d5, and now finally knight takes a3 check. The king went to a2. If the king goes to a1, then the capture on c2 comes with check. The king went to a2, and now black captured the piece back. Well, if we look at this position, white is no longer up a piece, and all of the black pieces are attacking the white king. The c2 pawn is also attacked many times, so white has no good defense. In the game, white actually captured the knight short on time, but after the move queen takes c2 check, white resigned, as on the next move it's checkmate. If bishop to b2, black will simply capture it with checkmate, and if the king drops back to a1, then either rook to b1 checkmate or queen to b1 is checkmate. So this was a game played in the I played it in the Irish Championships, and the white player was an international master, an experienced international master. So we can see how even very high-level chess players can actually quickly go wrong in this variation. It's quite a dangerous variation from a white perspective as well. So we should be quite happy if we get these moves on the board. Let's go back to the position before white captured the bishop on c3. So let's put that on the board now. Okay, so now we have just taken a look at the move knight takes c3 here, and now we're going to take a look at our main line, which is queen takes c3 instead. Well, after queen takes c3, black should go in a little bit of a different direction than in the last time, because here the move knight to c6 wouldn't make much sense. First of all, the white queen is no longer on e3 with the knight on c3, so after d takes c5, here there was this possibility of d4, but in our main line, we don't have this possibility. Additionally, after pawn takes c5, we see that the d4 square is especially protected anyway, so we don't have even the advance available to us. So therefore, after queen c3, we shouldn't be playing knight to c6. Instead, we should support the pawn on c5 with knight to d7. Now here, white has a variety of options available to him. He could play, for example, the move bishop to d6 to try and frustrate black by pinning the knight to the rook and also put some pressure on c5. But here we can continue quite normally with moves such as either rook to c8 or rook to e8 on pinning ourselves, and we don't need to be too concerned about the loss of a pawn here on c5 because of the fact that, well, if white were to win a pawn, he would have to open up a lot of lines against his queen and his king. So this is going to lead to positions with chances for both sides. So this is bishop to d6. Another possibility instead of bishop d6 would be the move king to b1 here. And after king b1, I quite like the move bishop to b7, just striking at the pawn on e4 and asking white what exactly he's going to do. For example, he might play knight to g3 to support on e4, but then all of a sudden the d4 point would be more vulnerable. If white, on the other hand, closes down the position in the center with e5, black can always capture on d4 and have more play, easy play on the queen side. So this is the position in the case of king b1. Our main line is going to be the move bishop to g3 here. After bishop to g3, black should likely continue with the move rook to c8. And here, after rook c8, white here may play king to b1, stepping his king out of what may become a semi-open file. Now black can play another useful move, rook to e8. It's not the only move in the position, but I quite like this move just in case white at any point wants to crack open the center, or black may wish to crack open the center. The rook on e8 is a little bit more well placed. Also, there are no longer going to be any pins with bishop to d6, and the f8 square in some situations might be used by the black knight. After rook e8, white would now drop the queen back in order to, having first moved his king away, now get out of the line of fire of the rook. And here we're going to close our coverage with one key idea in these positions, which is that, well, we already saw in some situations you might want to drop the bishop back. In other situations, of course, leaving the bishop here, it's a pretty good diagonal. But Another possibility that I really quite like and that has been seen quite a lot in games is to capture this knight on e2. And this might seem to not make much sense. Why would black wish to eliminate a pretty good bishop and give white the bishop pair? But the idea behind this move is to now follow up with c4. Again, showing the same principle that in general, we don't want to keep a light squared bishop on the board if we're going to lock the position down along the light squares, because this bishop won't have much activity. So we first exchange the bishop, and only then we play c4 as black. And I really like black's chances in this position, because although white might have the bishop pair and have a good situation in the center, this gives him chances, black on the other hand has these pawns that he can roll up the board. He can at some point consider the move pawn to c3, either gambiting a pawn, or he can first try to support that move and try to storm up the board. And well, the truth is that I think black's play is easier to handle here because his plan is very, very clear. He's going to launch an attack on the queen side, whereas white's plan might have to be to play on the king side since the center is relatively closed, but his play on the king side should be a bit slower than black's play on the queen side. So if I had to take a position here in a tournament game, I would rather be playing black. And this line that I'm recommending, that I have recommended in this video on the fantasy variation, is one of the lines that is most respected by Caro-Kann specialists, and is played at the very, very highest levels with very good results for black. So I hope your results are equally good and that you've liked this video, and I hope to see you in another video soon.